Module 12, Installing vSphere Components. When installing your vSphere components, it's critical to understand the options in deploying the VMware vCenter server and the ESXi host. You can select the deployment options that best fit your enterprise or best fit your needs as a company. Lesson 1, Installing ESXi. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to meet the following objectives. Describe how to install ESXi interactively. Describe the other methods of an ESXi installation. And identify the basic requirements for a boot from SAN configuration. When installing an ESXi host, there are minimum requirements or prerequisites that are needed. And one of the big ones is it requires a 64-bit server, as in your AMD processor or your Intel Xeon processor. The server can have up to 160 logical CPUs, basically cores or hyperthreads, and can support up to 2048 virtual CPUs per host. And with that being said, there's a minimum of 4 GB of memory is required. An ESXi host can have up to 4 terabytes of memory, which is a max up to 4 terabytes of memory with a minimum of 4 gigabytes of memory. And although it states the 4 gigabytes is officially the minimum required, a more accurate minimum memory requirement is 8 gigabytes for better performance, kind of on the lower end when you're installing the ESXi host. Basically, if you have an 8 gigabyte of memory, you'll not be able to run virtual machines in a production environment. ESXi host must have, and I'm going to highlight these, must have a basic SCSI controller, 1 or more Ethernet controllers, an internal RAID controller, a SCSI disk or local RAID LUN. And taking all this in consideration for your best performance and security, you want to use separate network controllers for the management network and the virtual machine network. So basically you want to segment them away from each other. And if possible, use additional network separation for network storage and your VMware, your vSphere vMotion networks. And along with that, your ESXi, it supports installing and booting from SATA disk drives, SCSI drives, or serial attached SCSI disk drives. In this slide, we'll see some kind of like the basic information for installing the ESXi host. Basically, we'll see the defaults, basically when you go to install it, whether required or optional. And all this over here, you got your comments. Like right here, you got the vSphere comment can be used either with the host name or the IP address of the ESXi host. It must be at least 5 gigabytes if you install components on a single disk. And if you just take a look here, you basically just want to get the layouts of basically when you go to install it. These are going to be your default selections of each. And with a typical installation, you'll boot the ESXi installer and respond to the installer prompts to the ESXi to the local host disk. The installer will reformat and partition the target disk, meaning wherever you tell it to go, that's where it's going to reformat and partition that when it installs the ESXi boot image. If you haven't installed ESXi on a target disk before, all the data located on the drive is overwritten, including the hardware vendor partitions, the OS partitions, and any associated data that is along with it as well. But you also want to observe the following considerations. In an interactive installation, the system prompts you for the required system information. You'll want to verify that the server hardware clock is set to UTC, which can be changed in the BIOS or BIOS. You'll want to consider disconnecting your network storage. And reason being is this action, when you disconnect the network storage, it decreases the time that it takes for the installer to search for the available disk drives. And when you disconnect the network storage, files on the disconnected drive or disk are unavailable at the installation, which you want because you don't want no corruption or no install to go wrong. You want it to install correctly, and you want all the defaults to come out right when installing it as well. But I will say this. There's one thing that VMware cautions, and I've read quite a bit on. When disconnecting the network storage, do not disconnect a LUN that contains an existing ESXi installation or a VMFS data store that contains the installation of another ESXi host. These actions, they can affect the outcome of the installation by not making those ESXi installations visible to the installer, meaning that if you go to install it and they're not visible, you just won't see them if you disconnect the LUN or any other VMS data store that contains the installations, and you may want to have those installations available when you go to reinstall or install. You'll want to be prepared to record the values that you enter during this installation, such as the IP address, the subnet mask, the gateway, the primary DNS, the root password, and I will say this, the root password must contain 8 to 40 characters. That it's like a minimum requirement. Now, I'm pretty sure it's not, uppercase, lowercase, but you do want to stay within that 8 to 40 character minimum. And if you are installing an ESXi on a disk that contains a previous installation of ESXi or a VMFS data store, the installer provides you with options for upgrading. So basically, when you go to upgrade, it's going to go through all the upgrading process, and it will reboot on its own when it does that. So just be prepared for it to do a reboot on its own, and don't process the reboot, because I've seen it fail if you manually reboot and don't allow it to go through those steps of it rebooting itself. When installing your ESXi host, you must have an ESXi, the ISO, CD, DVD, or a USB flash drive, and you'll want to boot from the media to start the installer. And you'll also want to select the volume that is not formatted with the vSphere VMFS, which is the virtual machine file system. But if you'll notice here, it says right here, select a volume that is not formatted with VMFS. Now, don't let this fool you, meaning that these drives right here with the block device configured with RAID 5 doesn't mean that the one at the top will be the one that you'll want to put it on. Do not rely on the disk order when you go to select the disk. If the disk you selected contains data, the confirm disk selection page is displayed, meaning that when installing ESXi on a local disk, the local disk might not be the first disk in this list right here. All freshly installed hosts in the VMware or the vSphere 6 use a GUID partition table, which is a GPT format instead of the DOS style partition label. And this change, it supports the ESXi installation on disks larger than 2 terabytes, but up to a maximum of 64 terabytes. The partition table is fixed as part of the binary image and is written to the disk at the time the system is installed. The ESXi installer leaves the scratch and VMFS partitions blank, and then it creates them when the host is rebooted for the first time after installation or basically an upgrade. And the scratch partition is used to store the output of the vm-support command, which that command you'll need when you create a support bundle for the technical support from VMware. And the scratch partition is 4 gigabytes, and the rest of the disk is formatted as a VMFS 5 partition, virtual machine 5, file system 5 partition. And also, you want to take into consideration that there is a minimum gigabyte of 1 gigabyte is required for a boot device. And when rebooting from a local disk or a SAN, iSCSI, LUN, a 5.2 gigabyte disk is required to create the VMFS volume and a 4 gigabyte scratch partition on the boot device. If a smaller disk or LUN is used as the installer attempts to locate a scratch region on a separate disk. And take into consideration, upgraded systems do not use the GPT format, but do keep the older DOS-based partition labels as well. There are also other ESXi installation options available, and when I say other options available, you got the scripted ESXi installation, which means the script contains the host configuration settings, and the script must be stored in an accessible location such as your HTTP, HTTPS, FTP, NFS, CD, or USB, and a Pixie boot, and you can Pixie boot or PXE or Pixie boot installation is also possible with the scripted ESXi installation. Now, with the automatic ESXi installation with the vSphere auto deploy, the ESXi host loads the image directly into the host memory, and it can either be stateful or stateless. In a stateless installation, the ESXi OS is not written to the disk, and it is only stored in the ESXi host memory, which is beneficial for you to remember as well, just in case you run into an issue where you need it to go to the host memory and not write to the disk, depending on how you're wanting to set it up. Also, you've got a Pixie boot is used to contact the auto deploy server, and you have the vSphere auto deploy that uses the host profiles as well. And then, with that one being said, you've got the remote management applications, which is basically third party, and it can be used to install your ESXi also, which is Dell, DRAC, HP, the ILO, and the IBM RSA. Here you'll see that it is possible to boot an ESXi from your SAN, which you have your SAN here. Then you got your boot LUN, which it automatically comes up in your ESXi boots from here, and you got dual network cards coming out here into your switches going in. And one good thing about that is it's supported for fiber channel SAN. It supports iSCSI and fiber channel over Ethernet, and that's only for certain qualified storage adapters. Your SAN connections must be made through a switch topology, which is here, and unless the array is certified for direct connect, and the ESXi host must have exclusive access to its own boot LUN. Now, with this being said, you got to configure or consider certain benefits of booting from a SAN. Servers can be a little denser and run cooler without internal storage. You can replace the servers or have a new server point to an old boot location. You can have, servers without local disk. They often take up less rack space. And you can also back up the system boot images in the SAN as part of the overall SAN backup procedures. You've got creation and management of the boot image that is easier and more efficient, and then you can also access the boot disk through multiple paths, which protects the path from being a single point basically a single point of failure. But let me say this: you want to exercise caution that multipathing to a boot LUN is supported only in active arrays. And with that being said, to enable the boot from the SAN, you got several tasks to accomplish here. The tasks that you want to accomplish depend on which storage protocol are being used, such as fiber channel over Ethernet, which is FCOE, or hardware iSCSI, or your software independent hardware iSCSI. And basically, them are the three protocols when you go to boot from the SAN. But when booting from a local disk, a SAN or the iSCSI LUN, which is a 5.2 gigabyte disk that is required to allow the creation of the VMFS volume, and a 4 gig scratch partition on the boot device, you must configure the diagnostic partition on the shared SAN LUN. The diagnostic partition is accessed by multiple hosts, and you can store fault information for more than one host. So with that being said, if more than one ESXi host uses the same LUN on that diagnostic partition, then that LUN must be zoned so that all the servers can access it or come back to that one particular location. Each server will require 100 megabytes of space so that the size of the LUN determines how many servers can share it. Each ESXi host is mapped to a diagnostic slot, meaning that VMware recommends at least 16 slots or 1600 megabytes of disk space if servers share a diagnostic partition. And if the device has only one diagnostic slot, all the ESXi hosts sharing that device map to the same, or meaning that all of the ESXi hosts can share that device map to that same slot or that one diagnostic slot. That can create problems in the future. If two ESXi hosts perform a core dump at the same time, the core dumps are overwritten on the diagnostic partition, which goes back to you only having that one diagnostic slot, and it'll be probably harder to diagnose where the issue is coming from. If you use a iSCSI boot firmware table, which is IBFT to boot to an ESXi host from a SAN LUN, you cannot set up a diagnostic partition on the SAN LUN. Instead, you have to use the vSphere Management Assistant, which collects the diagnostic information from the host and stores it for analysis. And one of the last things is when setting up the host to boot from the SAN, you need to first boot the host from the VMware installation media. And this requires changing the boot sequence in the BIOS, because changing the boot system or boot sequence in the BIOS is vendor specific, meaning that one may be different than the other depending on your hardware. We've made it to the end of this module, or module 12, and at this point you should be able to meet the following objectives. Describe how to install ESXi interactively. Describe the other methods involved in an ESXi installation, and be able to identify the basic requirements for a boot from SAN configuration. Contact your instructor if you have any further questions.